first time I met Mr. McCullough, he was here in this room speaking about this book. In fact, his connection to the Historical Society goes back further than that, because when you hosted Smithsonian World, this wonderful program from the 1980s, there was a program about the attempt to preserve plants that were disappearing from the world. And in an episode, David McCullough stands at Monticello, in front of Monticello, holding in his hand something that I should have brought down, but is from our collection, which is the Garden Book of Monticello, Jefferson's records of all of his experimental gardening. And the thing that I'll never forget about this is sort of a wonderful connection of document and presentation was your kind of overwhelming enthusiasm for it. I think I'm paraphrasing, but I think said, I can't believe that I'm standing here holding this manuscript from Thomas Jefferson. And that's the beginning of a long connection through many projects done here, famously starting with the work on John Adams and going right up through perhaps less centrally connected with this project, with a recent project on the Wright brothers, but we do have some materials in that. And I can't help but saying the generosity of David McCullough is extraordinary. I was at the Library of Congress. We did a presentation there, and he was working on the Wright brothers book and invited me to a room set aside where he was going through the Wright brothers diaries and manuscripts. And I have held in my hand, thanks to this man, the account of the first flight, the diary account, which is a wonderful combination of this extraordinary event and an engineer writing out all the technical details of what went on then. But this connection is long-standing, wonderful, and we'll have some things to show you after Mr. McCullough speaks about things that he's worked on, including some of his favorite things.
Good morning, class. I want to begin by telling you that I think teachers are doing the most important work of anybody in our country today, and that you matter far more than most of us let you know, that you deserve more attention, more credit, more gratitude. I am very proud to have a son who teaches and a daughter-in-law who runs a school in Hingham. It's the oldest preschool school in the country, in Hingham, Massachusetts. And I have a granddaughter who's just embarking on a teaching career. And in many ways, I feel that what I've really been doing my whole working life is teaching, both from platforms or podiums, but also in the pages of my work. I want to start with two different teachers. They are unknown in general by the public, and maybe one of them you've heard of. Their first name, both were a Margaret. One was Margaret Phelps, and the other was Margaret McFarland. Margaret Phelps was a high school teacher. She taught English, she taught history in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century in the Middle West. And she was a favorite of innumerable students. But I want to read you, just to start, something she wrote. I think it's one of the finest statements I've ever read from anyone on the importance and the value of history. History cultivates every faculty of the mind, enlarges sympathies, liberalizes thought and feeling, furnishes and approves the highest standards of character. Let me just do that again a minute. Every faculty, it cultivates every faculty of the mind, It enlarges sympathies. Now imagine we could all enlarge our sympathies. Liberalizes thought and feeling, not just thought, but feeling, how we feel about things. Furnishes and approves the highest standards of character. Character above all. Margaret McFarland was unmarried. She was thin and not a particularly attractive person physically. Large hairdo on top. But she just happened to be Harry Truman's favorite teacher. And he talked about her all his life. Harry Truman, as you probably all know, never went to college. He's one of the very few. But he had a high school education that in many ways was superior to what some colleges are providing today. And he was a great student of history all of his life. And he knew that history mattered in leadership, a sense of history. And he knew the basic realities of what history teaches, that nothing of consequence is ever accomplished alone. It's always a joint effort, just what Peter Drummey was talking about. My work has depended on innumerable other people to help. He also learned that our actions have consequences. But I think the most important thing that he learned is what Margaret McFarlane was talking about there, that character counts above all. Now the second Margaret McFarland, had a very high reputation professionally. She taught psychology and child psychology at the University of Pittsburgh Medical School and the University of Pittsburgh itself. And here's what she said, that if you're teaching, show them what you love. Show them what you love. Now, you can't love something you don't know any more than you can love someone you don't know. So therefore, know what it is you're talking about. And that attitudes aren't taught, they're caught. They're caught from the teacher. Show them what you love, and attitudes are caught, not taught. Now, what makes Margaret McFarland infinitely interesting as a figure in history, as is Margaret Phelps, because of that one student in particular, is one student of hers in particular, and that was Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, who reached more children, taught more children, if you will, than any human being who ever lived. There's a new book coming out by Maxwell King about Mr. Rogers and about the part that Margaret McFarland played in his life and his training. He was going to her for advice and for help until the end of her life, regularly, working with him on his shows. And he, of course, was one of the most remarkable people on television ever, irrespective of whether it was an adult or child audience. I knew him a little bit, not much, but I can tell you that he was an impressive man, and his great love was music. And of course, music plays a huge part in his programs, and always did right from the beginning. And the idea that he would get down, literally, physically, to their level, to the level of a child, and that he taught kindness and the importance of kindness. And he taught that everybody has something about them that's interesting and of value. He was really, in many ways, a minister without preaching from the Bible. He was preaching from his own effective understanding of human nature. Those two teachers, in their way, I think, make the point. There ought to be a statue of Margaret Phelps in Independence, Missouri. There ought to be a statue somewhere, a memorial of some kind in Pittsburgh for Margaret McFarland. I wish I had known her. She sounds like one of the most interesting people ever. And her great source of inspiration and her understanding of how to teach history is that she said, tell stories. And so did Barbara Tuchman. She once wrote, there's no secret, no trick to teaching or writing history. Tell stories. I don't consider myself, and this is a public a confession, I don't consider myself an historian. I'm called an historian, I'm called a biographer, and that's fine. I have no advanced degrees. I was an English major. I never imagined I would be writing history. But I always wanted to write stories. I either wanted to write novels or I wanted to write plays. And I got that idea in grade school, again, because of teachers. And I'm sure, as each and every one of you can provide your names of those teachers who changed your life, I had several teachers, absolutely, I'm forever indebted to, because they changed my life. They opened up my eyes to seeing things in a way that had never happened before. It happened in grade school, high school, and in college. While I was in college at Yale, Thornton Wilder, the great playwright, he lived outside of New Haven, and he was around a lot. He was a fellow of Davenport College, so where I lived. And if you went in to have lunch at the dining hall, he'd often be sitting there, and you could go over and sit down and talk with him. Imagine. One of the greatest playwrights and novelists ever. And one day somebody asked him why he wrote the plays he did or the novels that he did. And he said, I imagine a story I'd love to see performed on stage or read in a book, and so I check around, if nobody's written it, I write it so I can see it performed on stage or I can read it in a book. Well, that's what got me, in a way, into doing what I do. I was doing research for a project that I was involved with at the U.S. Information Agency, the old government agency which provided libraries and magazines and newspapers for the whole world up until, I guess, 40 years ago. It was dispensed with, which was too bad. In any event, I was doing work in the Library of Congress in the prints and photographs section. And I came in, they had big tables like this where you could spread things out. And on one table were spread photographs taken in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, right after the disastrous breaking of the South Fork Dam in 1889. And I stopped to look at them. And I couldn't believe the destruction, the violence portrayed in those photographs. A photographer from Pittsburgh had gotten over the mountains and down into the town. And I thought, I've heard of the Johnstown Flood much of my life, but I didn't know what happened. I remember, all I really knew at that point was that when we were kids growing up in Pittsburgh, which is not very far from Johnstown, we'd make a lake of gravy in the mashed potatoes at the dinner table, and then we'd break through the potatoes with our fork, and as the gravy flowed down among the peas, we'd say, the Johnstown Flood. So I took a book out of the library, and it wasn't very good. For one thing, the author didn't seem to understand the geography of Western Pennsylvania. That at least I knew. So I took another one out, and it was even less satisfactory. It was a potboiler written at the time. It was mostly made up. So I said to myself what Mr. Wilder had said to himself, why don't you write the book you'd like to read about the Johnstown Flood? And by doing the research for it, you'll find out why it happened. So that's what I did. And as soon as I got going, I knew this is what I want to keep on doing as long as I can. And academic historians always want to know, what's your theme? Well, they'd say, well, what's your theme? I'd make something up. I had no idea what my theme was. No, truly, I thought eventually, maybe, by the time I finish the book, I'll know what my theme is. And I did. And that is that it's extremely dangerous, perhaps even perilous, to assume that because people are in positions of responsibility, they are therefore behaving responsibly. That catastrophe, that breaking of that dam, need never have happened, should never have happened. It was the worst disaster in the history of our country up until 9/11. And I think that there is a clear lesson to be learned. And also a lesson of how you recover from destruction of that kind, how you recover in your attitude, well, we'll keep going. The lessons to be learned for history are, let us say, infinite, truly infinite. And that's one of the reasons they're so important. There's no such thing as a foreseeable future. Being first isn't always best. Gone but not forgotten. No. If you're not forgotten, you're not gone. And that's a good reason to want to be writing or teaching history. These people aren't gone as long as we don't forget them, and as long as we don't dismiss them as somehow not up to our standards. I think that the essential thing to remember in teaching or writing history is human. History is about people. It's not memorizing dates or quotations or statistics. It's what happened, to whom, by whom, and why, and what can we learn from that? And to ever say they were just like we are, no, they were not. You have to understand that, because among other things, they lived in a different time. I'm writing a book right now. It's a dream I've had, well, since I first saw or heard about Mr. Wilder's Our Town. I'm writing a book now about people you've never heard of. And that was I thought, wouldn't that be great to write a kind of version of Our Town, only it's about real people. You've never heard of them. But once you get into their lives, once you get into what their dreams are, their worries, their advantages, their disadvantages, their handicaps, their tragedies, you get tied up in it because it's a story. Well, paths lead us in all kinds of surprising ways, and of course that is also so very evident in any history or biography of other people. And I was invited to come out to the Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, in 2004 to give the commencement address for their 200th anniversary. And there was a building in the middle of the campus called Cutler Hall. And I asked somebody, who is Cutler? And they didn't seem to know much about him, so I traced who he was, and I was hooked. And then one thing leads to another, and I found that in Marietta, Ohio, is a whole gold mine of original letters, diaries, memoirs, unpublished things, records of the people who first created the first legal settlement in all of the Northwest Territory, in the Marietta College archive. Phenomenal. It's one of the most exciting discoveries I've ever experienced in 50 plus years during which I've been writing books. And a marvelous librarian who knows the collection and who's excited about the collection. And I've been working on this book for 2 years. I'm up to the first draft of almost the last chapter, and we're still discovering things because these families all wrote to each other in various stages of their lives, but also at 3 generations. 5 principal characters, each of whom was extraordinary, each of whom accomplished major and worthy accomplishment in the face of such adversities as we can hardly imagine. So when I say they weren't the way we are or like we are because they lived in a different time, this to me is as vivid proof as I've experienced yet. The disadvantages, the physical, mental, and family stress that they all went through. And of course, they had none of our advantages. They had no power tools. They had no medical assistance as we know it. People were stunned by how much people, when they're reading about that time, are stunned about the consumption of whiskey. Well, that was their anesthetic. That was their bare aspirin. You gave if a child had a toothache, you gave the child some whiskey. It was in every house. It was just part of life. And of course, some people went too far with it. And the high aspirations, as I hope you all know, the Northwest Territory, when they established the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, it said in this huge empire that we had managed to get the British to cede to us after the Revolution, the end of the Revolution, much to the credit of John Adams and the Paris Treaty of 1783. It doubled the size of our country. This one law that this one man, Manasseh Cutler, got through the Congress, so that out of it would come 5 states: Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. 5 states, as big as all of the original 13 colonies, and it established that in those 5, in that territory, there would be complete freedom of religion. There would be public support for public education, in other words, taxes for public schools, all the way through college, thus the creation of state universities, and no slavery. Now imagine, there were slaves in every state, every of the original 13 colonies, and suddenly we've doubled the size of the country and there's no slavery. And of course the Ohio River, which was the highway west, there were no roads, no bridges, no trails even hardly, and there'd be no, and of course the Ohio Northwest Territory, north and west of the Ohio River, that then becomes the dividing line between freedom and slavery. And it was done by one man lobbying Congress, the one man who was a classic 18th century polymath. He was both had doctoral degrees in divinity, law, and medicine, and practiced all 3 at one time or another. But he was the minister of a church right up here in Hamilton, Massachusetts. Still, the church is still there. His home is still there. And he put that through. And yet we don't know anything about him. So I thought, giving credit where credit is long overdue is part of the joy of this work. And I hope that I've done them justice, men and women and their families, because the families then carry it on. There became a point, for example, after the Republicans, the Jeffersonians, took power, when Jefferson was elected, when they tried to get they changed the law so that slaves could be admitted to Ohio. And Manasseh Cutler's son, who had gone out and settled in Ohio, the father had too much else going on, too many other responsibilities. He had become a member of the first legislature of Ohio, Ephraim Cutler. And the day they were going to vote on it, this is like something that if you put it in a movie, people will say, well, that would never happen. Yes, it did happen. The day that they were going to vote on whether to take down the old rule and let slaves in, he was too ill to go. He was almost deathly ill in bed. And Rufus Putnam, General Rufus Putnam, one of the major figures of the Revolutionary War, came to him, and he was one of the settlers of this same territory, same town, came to him and said, the vote's going to be today, you've got to go there. He said, I can't do it. He said, yes, you can. So they got him up, and he got there and went in and voted, and the slavery rule was saved, no slavery was saved by one vote. And yet, nobody knows about this man, even in Ohio. So that's the excitement of discovery. I have never, again, another confession, truth in advertising here. I have never known much about any subject I've undertaken. And if I knew all about the subject, I wouldn't want to undertake it, because it's the learning process. It's the discovery on your own. It's the work that goes into it, and the working with good people, good archivists, good experts on one subject or another. And that's why in my teaching, I have tried to bring what I call the lab technique to the teaching of history, where you don't give them everything. You let them find out themselves. You give them a project to work on. And guide them when they want help, but don't just say, here it is, and memorize it so you'll do well on the test. Now here's what system, I've used many various techniques to do this. I did one I taught at Cornell for a term as a guest professor. And I had a large lecture course, 157 students. But we met for seminar gatherings once a week, too. I had several helpers for those. And I told them at the start of it, as you probably all know or maybe experienced when you were in college, you now can go and listen to a professor lecture or teach for 2 weeks before you decide whether to take the course. And naturally, one of the things they're trying to find out is how hard is it going to be. But I told them I wasn't going to tell them anything about the course until after the 2 weeks were over. But I did say that you're going to be required to write a paper which will constitute half your grade, and it'll be a project such as you've never undertaken. So what I did was I gave them each a photograph or an illustration, a reproduction of a painting or engraving. Nobody got the same photograph or the same engraving. And they were told minimal information. Graduating class, Tuskegee University, 1912, photograph of the class. Courtesy, Tuskegee University. Oil tanker Savannah being sunk by a German submarine off the coast of Florida, February 8th, 1942. Source, Sinclair Oil, etc. Sgt York, courtesy Army Department, Washington, D.C. And then it was all up to them. Write it, do it. And keep in mind that when you finish, you will probably be, over many, maybe more than 2/3 of you, you will be the leading expert on that subject anywhere. You can proudly say so. Well, what was interesting was some of the people who had students who were known to be high grade superstars didn't like this. They didn't want to mess with that. And then I had one young fella come in. He was the one who got the photograph of Sgt York. And he came in. He said, I have no idea who this is or what this is about. I said, well, what do you know about World War I? He said, all I know is I've always wondered about World War I. All I know is that there had to have been a World War I if there was a World War II. Later on, years later, probably 20 years later, this young lawyer came up to me, stopped me on the streets in Washington, and said, Mr. McCullough, I was in your class at Cornell. I said, oh, were you? I said, what picture did you get? And he said, Sgt York. I said, I remember your paper, truly did remember. It was superb, absolutely superb. And I said, that paper could have been published. He said, well, I just wanted you to know that World War I has been my hobby ever since. It sticks, it works. And most of them thoroughly enjoyed the idea that nobody else had been there before, that they were breaking fresh ground. So I highly encourage that kind of thing, or joint efforts. Take a building in town or in your neighborhood, which has a story, and you get 3 students, let's say, to work on it, to make a little mini television kind of thing. One guy uses the camera, another person does the research, another one's the on-camera figure, something like that. And it can work at all levels. One of my granddaughters, in the 6th grade in the public school in Hingham, or maybe it was 5th grade, but anyway, grade school, each of the students in the class was to play the part and know all about a president or a first lady. But if you were a girl, you could be a male. And my granddaughter, understandably, I guess, said that she'd be Harry Truman. So they were to read up all about their character. They were going to and they were going to present that character at an evening gathering with their parents. And maybe some of you have done this with your students too. Well, it was one of the most remarkable evenings I've ever attended. Franklin Roosevelt was in a wheelchair. Harry Truman was dressed just like Harry Truman, and on and on. And each one of these little guys, girls got up and said, I'm so-and-so and so-and-so, and rattled it off. But what was so interesting, they worked at tables of 4 at each table. So if Harry Truman was one, you learned all the other 3 too, because you were working. So they would come away knowing a great deal about 4 presidents, which they'd never have forgotten. I wish that maybe this is happening now. I wish more plays were being written to be performed by young people, grade school age, about history, because that way you could get quite a cast. I remember I was interviewing a minister in Independence, Missouri, who knew Mr. Truman, and particularly during the years when he was retired. And he would walk with the president. As you probably know, Harry Truman liked to take a morning walk every day. And I was talking with him about it, and I said, did he ever do anything or say anything that stuck in your mind or seemed a little different? He said, only one thing. I said, what was that? He said, well, there's an old ginkgo tree over here on Elm Street, and every time we walk by, he'd speak to it. I said, he would? I said, what did he say? He said, you're doing a good job. So I can't go by that tree either without saying, you're doing a good job. Ginkgos live a very long time. There's But it's if you can get the reader, the student, into the humanity of the person, get the student to write about the person, or to do something in which they are really involved. In my experience, one gets to know those people from other times as well, or maybe often even better than you know people in real life. Because for one thing, in real life, you don't get to read other people's mail. And it's in the letters that Harry Truman wrote to Bess, or that Abigail wrote to John Adams. That's where you really get inside the humanity of it. When in the course of human events, the operative word there is human. And I had a seminar, a discussion group in a history course I took at college under a young graduate student. And he started off by saying, I don't want any of you to feel you have to memorize any dates or any quotations. That's what books are for. You can look it up. And it was as if he'd opened up the window and let fresh air in from the Rocky Mountains or something. It was absolutely transforming. Now, there's one more point that I want to make with all the emphasis I can muster. History isn't just about politics and war. Yes, politics and war are an immensely important part of it. But so too are art and music and science and medicine and finance and ideas. Ideas. So too is luck. Good luck, bad luck. When I was working on my book about the Revolutionary War, and I came to understand how the army that was trapped on Brooklyn by the British, how they escaped out of pure luck. Incredible. The whole thing could have ended right then, very, very quickly and decisively. I was driving down Massachusetts Avenue one morning, and Embassy Row, and I got to Sheridan Circle, and it was a huge traffic jam. It just stopped. Everybody's rushing to work. And I looked over in the middle of the circle there, and there's old Phil Sheridan, General Phil Sheridan, up on his high horse, requisite pigeon on his hat, and I thought, I wonder how many people riding around this circle every day, twice a day, thousands of people, have any idea who that man was. And I thought, given the state of historic knowledge these days, probably very few. Very, very few. And it was making me feel pretty down, as was the traffic jam. I had the car radio on, and on came Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. It just lifted me right out of that chair in the car and my doldrums. And then I thought, who's more important to us today? Phil Sheridan or George Gershwin? You can't leave the Gershwins out. You can't ignore the fact that one of the oldest testimonies of history of human history we have are cave paintings, are very early statues, architecture, infinitely important. When I was working on my book, The Greater Journey, about the Americans who went to Paris to better themselves in art or music or medicine, I wasn't sure where it was going to end, whether I would end it with the turn of the century or end it 19th to 20th century, or whether I'd end it with the life of one protagonist. And I was looking at Edith Wharton and some other people whose lives crossed the line of that century into the early part of the 20th century. And I came upon Wilbur Wright in Paris. And I thought, what in the hell is Wilbur Wright doing here? He's meant to be out in a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio. And then I took a look at some of his letters that he was writing from Paris, and I was swept off my feet by the time he spent at the Louvre looking at paintings, the time he spent in the great cathedrals because he'd become interested in Gothic architecture, and the incredible letters he was writing home to his family, his mother and father, his father rather. And I thought, this is a far more interesting human being than I ever had any idea. I think maybe in high school history we might have given 10 minutes to the invention of the airplane, one of the most important events of all time. And by the way, let us be true to our vocations and proud of it. Neither brother ever had any technological training. The two men who cracked one of the most seemingly impossible technological engineering problems of all time were educated in the humanities only. And they never even finished high school. Well, excuse me, Orville did. Wilbur never did. But they never stopped reading. They grew up in a house that had no running water, no electricity, no indoor plumbing, no telephone. Father was an itinerant minister. They had no money. You could put you could put the house and another half besides in this room. But it was a house full of books. And the father insisted they keep reading and always read above their level. And they were reading history, literature, all the liberal arts education embodies. And they never stopped reading. And he told them, learn to use the English language, both on paper and on your feet. And when you read their letters, you realize not only did they have extraordinary vocabularies, but they wrote superbly. You have to understand the people. And one of the lessons the Wright brothers, one of the lessons of almost every book I've written is don't give up. Have purpose, have high purpose, worthy purpose, and don't give up. George Washington would not give up. John Adams would not give up. None of them. Washington Roebling, building of the Brooklyn Bridge, wouldn't give up when he was paralyzed practically by the effect of the bends. And don't ever leave the women out. And of course, that's where we have a lot of catching up to do on that. And I'm very proud to say that with Emily Roebling, Catherine Wright, the sister of the Wright brothers, obviously Abigail Adams, and others, I feel I have brought them on center stage in the light, not standing on the sides or in the wings and just being mentioned. And their part was in not only identifiable, but invaluable, always. I have been telling people about a book I read 60-some years ago called The Natural Superiority of Women. And I wish it were back in print. It is fascinating about the physical and mental superiority of women. Women live longer, they're less susceptible to disease, they are stronger physically in a per pound ratio, and they mature faster, and their brains are more retentive as life goes on, because they're necessary to sustain life, whereas we men are dispensable once we've provided the reproductive necessities. Many people say, hasn't all the history been written? No, we're just getting started. Just getting started. I think, for example, when the future historians look at this time that we're living in now, I think one of the things they're going to say that was clearly outstanding and of utmost importance is all that's happened in medicine. It's incredible, and more's coming soon. I grew up in, as I said, in Pittsburgh. Polio was part of life. My brother contracted polio. My wife's brother contracted polio and was crippled his whole life. Now it's gone. And by the way, Jonas Salk, who did that work, was a very close friend and learned a lot from Margaret McFarland, the woman I told you about earlier. And the sad thing about future historians is that we don't write letters anymore, and there's a serious question about how long the electronic records will last. So I like to tell people, if you have any interest in immortality, start keeping a diary. Write about anything you want. And if you get to the point where you think the curtain's about to come down, give it to the Mass Historical Society. And it'll be quoted forever. I think that we have, as most civilizations down the years have all had, we have very many institutions and established ways of life that we take for granted and shouldn't. And one of those is our system of public libraries. No country in the world has anything like it. Imagine, you can go anywhere in this country, and there's a public library, and you can go in there, and in theory, or in fact, reality, you could get yourself a complete education for free. Free to the people, it says on the marvelous Boston Public Library over the door. If you get down sometimes about the level of culture in our day, which is understandably prevalent, just keep in mind that there are more public libraries in America than there are Starbucks or McDonald's. They're everywhere. And historical societies, historical museums, archives like this one. There's nothing. Imagine we have the papers of all the Adamses. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, but somebody once told me that the Adams papers are all they've been Xeroxed for the family papers, and if you stretch them out, they'd reach more than 5 miles. It's all there. There are over 1,000 letters between John and Abigail Adams, and neither of them could write a boring letter or a short one. and the papers of Jefferson, about half of all the Jefferson papers, including the most personal of them, are here. I spent literally about 10 years working in this collection, both for my Adams book in 1776 and, as Peter suggested earlier, others. And it is thrilling to hold those papers, those letters in your own hands. It's a connection with them, and you're holding it the same distance from your eyes as they held it from their eyes. There's a tactile connection that I would never want to have to give up. And you're reminded that it isn't all that long ago, as things are in reality. Imagine this. If I had grown up in Dayton, Ohio, and happened to live in the neighborhood where Orville Wright lived, I could have known him. I would have been about 15 or so, and he would have been that nice old guy out taking a walk every morning to say hello. And yet, every airport, it's all over the world. He changed the world. 2 people. And they changed it dramatically and against every prediction. They flew the first plane in 1903. It wasn't until 1908 that we finally said, oh, man can fly. because everybody knew that human beings can't fly. Therefore, this didn't happen. And all they had to do was ride out to the cow pasture outside of Dayton, and there the brothers were flying regularly whenever the weather was good. So there's much going on right now that we think, oh, well, yeah, but that can't happen. That won't work. Right now, as reported in the New York Times and confirmed by some people that I know personally, they are stitching two mice together. One's an old mouse, one's a young mouse. And something in the blood transferred, you ready? Makes the old mouse young, but does not do any damage to the young mouse. So start thinking about who you want to be stitched to. No, truly, it can't be very far down the road. So then what do we do when people are living even longer? Big reality to face. But as I said earlier, there's no foreseeable future. I think that history is a antidote to self-pity and self-importance. Very important. I also think it's essential to leadership. The greatest, best presidents we ever had, without any exceptions, were all students and or actual authors of history. And I think that using the presidency as an example is only an easy way to talk about leadership. It's true in all fields. I find that doctors particularly are very interested in history, probably because they're interested in human life. But time and again, doctors will come up to me and say, I like your books. And they often say, I've got a book in me. And I say, good for you, go to it. I feel like saying, yeah, I'm going to take out an appendix someday. So one day, I said that to a doctor, a young doctor. I really liked him. I said, yeah, I'm going to take it. He said, oh, I could teach you how to do it in 3 days. That's one of the things, one of the lessons of history, the infinite possibilities in learning, the infinite capacity we human beings have to learn something that we don't know anything about. I hated physics. I hated math. I hated engineering talk and all that. But when I got working on the book about the Brooklyn Bridge, because it meant something to me to know how that all worked, I found I can do this if I can find someone that put it into the English language for me, explain it in the English language. We can all do it. Our capacities are infinitely beyond what we imagine they are. That's part of the fun. That's part of the adventure. And I'll come back to what I said at the very beginning. You people, you are doing the work that matters most. And we just can't thank you enough. There.
Would you take some questions?
Oh, sure. I don't agree with the history repeats itself. Sometimes, of course, it does, but innovation, change, is the rule of history. Life and human adventure or human tragedy and the rest don't keep happening the same way. They really don't. It's a river that keeps changing as it goes, and the innovation that takes place, not just with development of new machinery or new insights into the makeup of the DNA or whatever, that's constant change. Harry Truman said the only new thing in the world is the history you don't know, which I think is a wiser observation. And one of the lessons of history is that it's changing all the time. change is part of life. Change is part of the human story. And the circumstances, the surroundings, the set, if you will, the setting. I think where you grow up is extremely important in how you turn out as a person. And I speak for my own experience in childhood. We grew up with a work ethic, unquestionably, in Pittsburgh. If you were a good worker, you were all right. You were welcome. You were acceptable. That wasn't the Puritan work ethic. There was no moral or religious connection to it. And I think we grew up more tolerant, perhaps, than other American cities about diversity of background and religion, because so many people were pouring in there as laborers in the mills and all of that from every part of the world. On the streetcar in boyhood, you'd hear 5 different languages being spoken all the time. So when people started talking about diversity, I thought, wait a minute, what's new about that? Whereas, of course, if you grow up on a farm or if you grew up down south, it'd be very different. But the one thing that does unite us is education. I don't think we can ever underestimate the importance of education. And yes, some things are really deeply in trouble right now. Public education in other states at this point is shameful. In Arizona and in Arkansas, I just came back from Oklahoma. There are over 2,000 teachers teaching in public school today who have no experience in teaching, let alone training as teachers. Desks are broken down. Textbooks are being held together by old Scotch tape, and they will not raise the taxes, which is essential. But it's the same thing in Arizona and else in West Virginia. It's disgraceful. It's not the American way. But at the same time, there are other public schools, many of them right here in this area, that are superb. I have 19 grandchildren, I'm proud to say, and most of them have gone through public schools and good public schools and gone on to good colleges and universities. No, and I just can't tell you how important you all are. How many of you are teaching, if I may do this, how many of you teaching in grade school? High school? Public schools? Everybody? Middle school? I forgot middle school. Back in the good old pioneering days that I grew up in, there were no middle schools. Another question?
Can I ask, have you considered writing anything about Native Americans who are the real owners of this land?
Well, yes, I have. In fact, I'm writing about them to a degree right now. Only as part of a larger story. I've never written about it particular. I guess if I were to pick one, it would be Tecumseh. I like old Tecumseh. Good man.
Here in, I saw Massachusetts, the spirit of America in auto registration plate, in car plate. License.
What? Yeah. Oh, the American spirit on the license plate.
Right.
What's the?
Why Massachusetts can claim here American spirit is?
Here, because it,
And also, how can you describe American spirit? How can you teach American spirit? Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, pal. We rehearsed this.
My name is
Yeah.
Elizabeth Hanson. I teach at Ashland High School. And I was just wondering if you could explain why Jefferson's papers would be here rather than in Virginia.
Peter better explain that.
The Coolidge collection of Thomas Jefferson manuscripts are at the Massachusetts Historical Society because of a love story. In 1824, Joseph Coolidge, a young businessman and MHS member, went to Virginia with a letter of introduction to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was very impressed by Joseph Coolidge, but Jefferson had a favorite granddaughter, Ellen Wales Randolph, who was even more impressed by Coolidge. And the following year, they married at Monticello, came back here to Massachusetts, named their youngest son Thomas Jefferson Coolidge, and while the Jefferson family had sold Jefferson's public papers to the Library of Congress, his personal papers passed down in family hands, and at the end of the century, in 1898, Thomas Jefferson Coolidge made the first of a series of extraordinary gifts of Jefferson's personal papers, including the architectural drawings and records of Monticello, to the Historical Society.
Speaking of Monticello, I am a firm believer, as I'm sure many of you are too, that one of the best of all ways to bring young people into history at any age is to go with them to an historic place, to go with them to where it happened. And it doesn't have to be something huge that happened, but something interesting and or huge. To go to Gettysburg, for example, and see the scale of that battle, you never forget it. Or to go to Monticello or Mount Vernon, or here to this city. Every corner, every street, almost, is a story unto itself. Also, I strongly urge teaching and teachers to not just use textbooks. Alas, I didn't use textbooks when I taught my course at Cornell. I picked books that I knew were compelling to read. And I picked fiction as well as nonfiction, just to get them into the tent, get them into the sense of the drama and the pull of these stories and those people. And encourage parents to take their children on these trips to historic sites. In many ways, that works better even than going with a school group. It certainly worked for me dramatically. Yes, sir.
Thank you, first of all. My name is Charlie Newhall, and I teach at a place called St. John's Prep in Danvers. And like many of us here, my students, and I'm sure many people here, students, create documentaries, they write narratives, they write analytic essays to uncover the past and see how it makes us and them who we are today. I wonder if you would talk about the difference between telling stories in books and telling them in documentaries, and perhaps about the responsibility of those who use more accessible media, from documentaries to feature films, to authenticity.
Well, thank you. I've been involved a lot with documentaries, and I guess for over almost 20 years I did for PBS, and I guess probably my best known work was the narration of Ken Burns' The Civil War, which was a huge undertaking, to say the least. But there's no question that those documentaries are reaching a far larger audience than all but a very few books. And that's good. I am a little concerned about the format and the sort of painting by numbers feeling that many of the documentaries have acquired. There's a new documentary out called The California Typewriter, and I highly recommend it. Not necessarily for using in class, but just for your own judgment. It's playing in movie theaters now, but I'm sure it'll be available, or maybe already is otherwise. It's about a man and his son who repair typewriters in Oakland, California. and about how their trade is diminishing because typewriters are no longer in the mainstream. And it's fascinating for several reasons. First of all, one of the greatest authorities and devotees of typewriters is Tom Hanks, who has the biggest collection of typewriters, I guess, anywhere in the world. And he's brilliant on how one typewriter type is different from another and so forth. But he also understands what has been lost in using the computer that was essential to the pull and the importance of the typewriter. For one thing, if you go to look at the manuscripts of people who wrote on typewriters, you can see the evolution of the page, of the storytelling, and how it's been rewritten and edited and so forth. With the computer, that all disappears. There's no tactile connection the way there is when you're working on a Royal typewriter, and I'm in the film. I'm part of the story, but only as people who are sort of sideline commentators about why we love or why we espouse the use of a typewriter. But the story is that the father-son, the father is an expert craftsman wizard with repairing typewriters. The son is a loyal son who isn't as good as his father, but is devoted to his father and will stay with him till the end. Well, it so happens that some of those weirdos that we are who care about typewriters are now discovering him. So business has been picking up, including one guy who collects old typewriter parts. He's a sculptor to make sculpture, and has become quite well known and highly well reviewed. But what's different about it is that the standard system of making a documentary is to show some film, show some stills, bring in an expert that makes the commentary, have a narrative that tells the story, a narrator, and so forth. This one is like a feature film in that there's no expert standing by doing the narration, or nobody's entering into the drama of the actual people themselves. And it's shot like a feature film. It's the real people doing the real thing. And I thought, whoa, this could be a really important new direction for documentaries. And I hope more people are going to be inspired by it, or that the same producer will continue on with it. One of the things that's interesting about this movie and the reality, when I first decided I was going to try and write a book, I'd been working in publishing for about 15 years before that. And we were issued, the way someone in the Army is issued a rifle, we were issued the old office-style typewriters. So I thought, if I'm going to write this at home, nights and weekends, I better not use my college portable. I'll get a real one. So we were living in White Plains, New York, and I went to a secondhand typewriter shop, bought this typewriter for $25. It was 25 years old. It's now been in use for 55 years. I've never written anything on any other device, and there's nothing whatever wrong with it. So it's a prime specimen of superb American manufacturing. No planned obsolescence in this baby, I'll tell you. All I have to do is change the ribbon, and that's not hard at all to do still, thank goodness. But the answer to your question is, I hope we're moving ahead. I had a fellow who works in the Star Market over here in the Back Bay. I couldn't find, we had all those snowstorms 2 or 3 years ago, and we were living here then, and we'd go over to get necessary supplies to survive. And whenever there was a break in the storm, the maybe some of you live here or were here, the drifts were 9 feet high, and nothing was working, nothing was going. And it was a panic, like everybody with the Russians are in Maine or something. And I had a list that Rosalie made up, my wife, and I found everything on the list except the cashews. Now, you know you can't survive without cashews. So there was a guy walking by with a Star Market sign on his shirt. I said, "Excuse me, could you please tell me where the cashews are?" And he said, "Yes, follow me." So I did. I thanked him. And about 10 minutes later, I was checking out at the cash register, and he came up to me, and he said, "Excuse me, but that voice, your voice, were you by chance the narrator of the Ken Burns Civil War series?" I said, "Yes, I was." He said, "Well, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart." He said, "Because when that series first came on the air, I was suffering terribly from insomnia." I heard that voice and I went right out. So you never know what form compliments are going to come in. Yes.
Cynthia Cowan, and I'm a museum educator who actually works closely with the Newton Public Schools, really kind of across the grades. So my question for you has to do with, over the years, you've told a lot of stories, but you've been exposed to, I'm sure, countless more. Can you tell us a little bit about the stories that you've chosen not to tell, or the stories that you haven't felt that you could tell?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Well, I should have brought, I have a list at home somewhere of ideas, what they occur to me for a possible book. And I think at one point there were 29 items on the list, but they're all around, and particularly in fields that the ordinary flow of historical research and historical writing doesn't yet verge into that. I think some of the former presidents who have been sort of dismissed deserve much more attention. I think Gerald Ford, for example, is wide open for a good book. Was a very good man, and he had a very short presidency, but it was very full of events of consequence. And he was not at all like he was portrayed. I think it was Johnson said he played football too often without a helmet, you know, and then he tripped coming down the steps out of an airplane, and it was sort of, he was the dodo. Well, he wasn't at all. He was a very interesting gentleman, and I was invited to come out to the Ford Library and speak, and that's when I had a chance to spend a whole day with him, and he walked me through the entire museum there, very knowledgeably and patiently, and I thought, boy, you deserve a different study of you than you've had so far. Medicine and disease, I think, are the epidemics that took place, and the heroic efforts of nurses and doctors are wide open for good work, good books. I think that tangible, tactical accomplishment is always open for more attention and study of all kinds. I think that the lives of our artists, our architects, our musicians, our poets. Well, here's one right now. I think the great lyricists of the Broadway hit era, Hammerstein, Cole Porter, they are poets, and they ought to be treated with the respect of poets. They are poetry, and a book on that alone would be a wonderful book. Some of those beautiful lyrics. In the still of the night, while the world is in slumber, the times without number, when I say to you, do you love me? And then in the still chill, while the moon's growing dim on the rim of the hill, in the still chill of the night. The end of one of Cole Porter's great. And the idea that the man who wrote those lyrics also wrote the music. The man was brilliant in the extreme. And Hammerstein, too. I think the words to Oklahoma are about as beautiful a piece of American poetry of all. I also think I'd love to see a book. I have the idea for the book I wish I could read. I would love to read a book that would take self-portraits, take 15 artists or so, or 10 artists, self-portraits, and the portrait would be on the left-hand page, and then there would be an essay chapter about that artist and what the portrait is saying and what the portrait isn't saying about the artist. But of course, he's painting himself, or she is painting herself, and there's wonderful material in that subject. I went to the keepers of the papers in the Library of Congress, and I said, I'd like to know what collections do you have that have been ignored, that are really rich? And he said, well, it'll take me about 2 weeks to come up. He said, but nobody's ever asked me that question. Because we all go in, what do you have on whatever it is we need, what we want? And nobody, and he came back with, I think, 5 or 6 wonderful answers, some of which have since been fulfilled by other people. I want to make one point. I find it very hard and it doesn't appeal to me to write about anything or anybody who's lived within the last, say, 50 years. You have to wait for the dust to settle. You have to see what comes after. You have to see how the story or the importance of the individual's work or of the individual, how well it holds up as time goes by. But there's no shortage, my goodness. I will never be able to do it, but I would love to have had another 10 years in which I could write the story of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My God, what happened there, and what happened there that was of infinite importance to the unfolding of our country's story. It's wide open. And it's so true of other places, too. Yes, now, next question.
My name is Kelly Morrow. I will be getting my graduate degree in 2 weeks to be a history teacher. And in the meantime, I have taught as a long-term substitute in Belmont, Cambridge, and Weston public schools. And my question to you, and I love how you said that you didn't teach with textbooks, but you taught with books that you knew would engage students. What would you say are your top 3 books?
Top 3?
Your top 3. If you were trying to get your students engaged outside of the textbook, what would your top 3 books be? And I'm going to run back.
The Little Engine That Could. I mean it. I mean it. Little Engine That Could. Go back and read that, what its message is. That's a hard question, very hard question. My problem is that my favorite book, or the book that's most important and so forth, changes with time and with whatever it is I'm working on. Well, I'm a great admirer of Samuel Eliot Morrison's big 1-volume History of the United States, as far behind as it may be. It's really a good, solid, reliable book, and he cares about people, and he's not bashful about expressing his own opinion, and open about it.
I think that was a trick question.
You think what?
Was that one of those trick questions?
That is almost a trick question, yeah. I'm sorry. I'll think about it next time.
Hi, can you hear me? My name is Cheryl. I'm actually an elementary educator and I'm a librarian. We're sort of in short supply these days in the elementary schools. But I would like to first of all, put in a plug for books at that level because we need to really get to these kids before they reach high school.
Right.
And they need to learn history. One of the best ways to do that is through picture books. I want to bring in Jefferson here. There's a terrific elementary level picture book called, I forget the name of it, but it's about Thomas Jefferson's books. Thomas Jefferson's Library, I think. It's a wonderful, wonderful read. I like to share it with kids all the time, but I'm struggling, so I need you to help me with this. I'm also about 100 pages short of finishing Annette Gordon Reed's The Hemmings of Monticello. And so but this morning I had this revelation because I've been having a little bit of negative thoughts about Thomas Jefferson. When you read that, it's really hard not to. But this morning I was thinking, oh, maybe his struggle with how to deal with his ownership of slaves and his eloquent writing of the United States Constitution may have had something to do with, he knew that this had to be rectified. And so this document was created that would eventually take us out of Egypt, as they say. And I'm just wondering what your feelings are on that subject, because for myself today, I thought maybe that was his ultimate goal, that he knew this had to be done, and he knew it had to be done for all Americans, including Native Americans, people of African descent, and women, I may add, who didn't get the vote until 1920. So that's my main question.
More than a few, probably 10 years ago, I started out to write a book about Jefferson and Adams as two extremely different characters who crossed paths because of their role in the early establishment of the country, who became co-workers, if you will, and friends, particularly when they were both serving overseas in diplomatic roles after the Revolution, who then, once they got into presidential politics, became rivals, and then really almost enemies, and then had a reconciliation and continued as active correspondents until the rest of their lives. And how could it possibly have been? Both died on the same day, and it was the 4th of July. Doesn't happen in real life. And I knew a good deal about Jefferson. I'd served on the board at Monticello, and I've always loved architects, the work of architects and architecture, and he was brilliant at that, brilliant. And the University of Virginia campuses is one of the great works of American architectural genius, no question. But I've soon found that whereas Adams was totally open in his correspondence and his wife's correspondence, we have nothing about Jefferson's wife. He destroyed every letter that she ever wrote to him, and that he even wrote to their friends and said, if you have any letters from my wife, I'd like to have them. And when they returned them, he destroyed them. We don't even know what she looked like. So it's going to be pretty hard to write a book where you've got this one blotted out character. And I just didn't like, why would you do that? Why would you do that? And of course, I don't like the hypocrisy of all free and so forth. There he's got 100, whatever it was, people out there working so that he doesn't have to lift a finger. No, that's not. Complicated was Thomas Jefferson. And I guess I'm a Yankee. I'm blue. I wear the blue uniform. And I mean that. I just do. There are many writers and Southern writers that I like very much, and I've had very many dear Southern friends. But that whole thing about slavery, oh. Peter Drummond just showed me a few days ago what is a synopsis of the Declaration of Independence prepared by Adams, in which there's a whole thing about no slavery. Where did that go? Who got that out of there? Who stopped talking about it? How much do we need to know about that? Maybe we never will. But it's interesting to note that of the original founders who became president, John Adams was the only one who never had a slave because he didn't believe in it. Up to, and the next one was his son. The people that I'm writing about now, who were all from here, New England, mostly all from Massachusetts, who went out to Ohio, were veterans of the Revolution who had been compensated in worthless money, script as they called it, and were being compensated further by free, or not free, very cheap, very inexpensive land in Ohio. And they were all abolitionists. They were all against slavery. And no kidding around about it. So, and then once that territory is beginning to open up and travelers are coming out, particularly in the early 19th century, particularly travelers from England or abroad somewhere. And they were writing about the difference between the way of life on one side of the river and the other side of the river. It shows you how really divided, and it was, where the slaves were everywhere on the lower side of the river and nowhere, only free blacks in the territory above. It was a terrible mistake to have allowed slavery to exist, to continue. And they felt, I guess, that you had to compromise in order to unify the colonies, in order to make a reasonable stand against the British. The idea that we could have had the audacity to think that we could win that war is in itself a story, a study. Every single odd was against us. All the odds were against us. We had no money, we had no army, we had no navy. We were up against the most powerful military force in the world. We were not by any means all for it. A third of us were for it, a third of us were against it, and there was another third waiting to see, in the old human way, who won. And George Washington made repeated mistakes that first year, 1776, and yet wouldn't give up, nor would the people who were so devoted to him. I think we're talking about the role of luck. One of the luckiest things that ever happened to us was George Washington, who was not just our first president, he was the commander-in-chief of the Army for 8.5 years, and then 8 years as six. So he was the ruling force, the leader, for 16 years. And his conduct in office was admirable in the extreme. He could have been awful. Well, we know about that now. No, truly. One of the things I think that history teaches us, and we should be teaching this, our young people this, is the exceptional president is an exception. They don't happen all the time. And sometimes we get even worse than unexceptional. It happens. It's part of life. Throw the dice, if you will.
I think you've just talked about how some of our founding fathers were deeply flawed human beings. So what can they teach the uninformed leader today? Because not all leaders are students of history. So I think those are general questions I'd like to ask.
The integrity, character, truth, honesty, kindness are all vitally important. and caution and respect for abilities beyond your own in positions of importance. One of my favorite of all stories about Truman is that he was about to appoint General Marshall, George Marshall, to be Secretary of State. And one of his young political advisors in a private meeting in the Oval Office said, well, you might want to think twice about that, Mr. Truman. And Truman said, why is that? He said, because if you appoint General Marshall Secretary of State, in a few months, people will start saying he would make a better president than you are. And Truman said, he would make a better president than I am. But I need the best people possible around me in all these important jobs. He knew exactly who he was. He never tried to be like anybody else. And he tried, as he said, I tried never to forget who I was, where I came from, and where I would go back to. Now that's seeing yourself in mature proportions and importance. I think that the job entails such responsibility, such an immense weight on one's shoulders as to be almost unimaginable to put yourself in that position. And that by studying these presidencies, any applicant can learn a great deal. And those applicants who don't bother to do that are making a vast mistake. And people are beginning to be more affected by the media and politics as a spectator sport than they are thinking about what's really at stake, not just for this week, but for their children and grandchildren. Anybody in that job has the power to produce evil, and sometimes accidentally, sometimes unintentionally, but at the same time, the great power to achieve marvelous, seemingly impossible. When Kennedy said, we will go to the moon, we should have they should be putting out high aspirations, noble aspirations, beyond materialistic and or financial benefit. And I personally, truly believe the most important objective should be education. Not just to bring it back to its best level up till now, but to make it even better than it's ever been. George H.W. Bush gave a marvelous speech on the importance of education at Monticello at one point in his presidency. And I've often thought, let's look that up. Let's get that out and see if we can reinstate that kind of ambition.
I would say thank you so much.
Thank you.